What if I told you that the most ruthless cartel boss in modern history was not hiding in the jungles of South America or the remote mountains of Mexico? What if I told you he was hiding in plain sight, funded, protected, and armed by the exact people sworn to destroy him? For 11 agonizing years, the United States government funneled millions of taxpayer dollars into a classified operation designed to dismantle the global drug trade. But they were not destroying a cartel, they were building one. This is the story of a phantom. A man who walked into the headquarters of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, sat across from elite federal agents, and handed them the ultimate weapon: information. He gave them exact coordinates, shipment schedules, and the names of the most dangerous syndicate leaders on the planet. The FBI thought they had found the holy grail of informants. They thought they were the puppet masters pulling the strings of the underworld. But in reality, they were the puppets. Every raid they conducted, every rival they locked up, every headline they claimed as a victory was carefully orchestrated by one man to eliminate his competition. How does a street-level thug manipulate the world's most sophisticated intelligence apparatus for more than a decade? The answer lies in a highly classified file that the government prayed would never see the light of day. Welcome to Shadow Dossier. The late 1990s and early 2000s marked a dark and desperate era in the global war on drugs. The streets were bleeding. The cartels were growing larger, richer, and infinitely more violent. Federal agencies were under crushing pressure from politicians and the public to deliver results. They needed major busts. They needed kingpins in handcuffs paraded in front of the media to justify their massive billions in operational budgets. It was an environment of pure desperation. And desperation breeds catastrophic mistakes. Enter the man we will call Informant X. He was not a high-ranking boss when he first made contact. He was a mid-level smuggler, a ghost moving through the shadows of the border towns, ambitious, but blocked by older, more powerful rivals. He understood a fundamental truth about power. You do not need an army to conquer a kingdom if you can trick an empire into fighting the war for you. Informant X initiated contact through a secure back channel, offering the FBI a deal that seemed too good to be true. In exchange for total immunity and financial compensation, he would provide surgical, devastatingly accurate intelligence on the inner workings of the most elusive cartels. The agents in charge were initially skeptical. Informants are notoriously unreliable, often feeding scraps to save their own skin. But Informant X was different. His first tip was a masterclass in deception and value. He gave the FBI the exact location of a massive subterranean drug bunker controlled by a rival faction. The raid was a spectacular success. Millions of dollars in narcotics were seized. High-ranking lieutenants were arrested. The media hailed it as a massive victory for law enforcement. The agents handling Informant X received commendations, promotions, and the intoxicating rush of absolute success. They were blinded by the glory. They believed they had finally cracked the unbreakable armor of the underworld. But they failed to ask the most important question: who benefits from this vacuum of power? The very night that the rival cartel was decimated by federal agents, Informant X made his move. While the FBI agents were celebrating their monumental bust, the informant's loyalists silently swept into the territories left defenseless by the raid. They took over the distribution routes. They absorbed the surviving foot soldiers. They claimed the vacant throne. Informant X did not fire a single bullet to destroy his greatest enemy. He used the full tactical might of the United States government as his own personal hit squad. And this was only the beginning. The FBI was now addicted to the intelligence he provided. He was their golden goose. The flow of high-level information was so consistent, so flawless, that the agents broke their own foundational protocols. They stopped verifying his claims through secondary sources. They stopped questioning his motives. They granted him an unprecedented level of operational freedom, believing that whatever minor crimes he was committing were a necessary evil for the greater good. This arrogance, this terrifying blind spot, allowed Informant X to construct an empire right under their noses. He began feeding them intelligence not just on rival drug lords, but on anyone who dared to question his authority within his own ranks. If a lieutenant grew too ambitious, Informant X simply leaked his location to his FBI handlers. The feds would kick down the door, make the arrest, and Informant X would solidify his absolute control. He was playing a game of three-dimensional chess, while the authorities were playing checkers. He created a perfect, self-sustaining loop of corruption and power. He fed the FBI enough targets to keep them happy, to keep the headlines glowing, and to keep the congressional funding flowing into their departments. In return, the FBI gave him the ultimate shield, immunity from prosecution. He was given a federal identification code, a ghost pass that allowed his vehicles to bypass border checkpoints without inspection. The system designed to stop the flow of poison was now escorting it. The psychological manipulation was brilliant and deeply sinister. Informant X studied his handlers. He understood their egos, their career ambitions, and their deep-seated fear of failure. He knew exactly how to phrase his intelligence, making the agents feel as though they were brilliant tacticians extracting secrets from a reluctant source. He played the role of a terrified insider, constantly claiming his life was in imminent danger, demanding more protection, more money, and more freedom to operate. The FBI handlers fell into the trap. They became emotionally invested in their asset. They began to view him not as a ruthless criminal, but as a flawed ally in a dirty war. This psychological tethering is the most dangerous phenomenon in intelligence work. When an agent loses objectivity, they lose control. And the agents handling Informant X had completely surrendered control. They were no longer directing his actions. He was directing theirs. As the years dragged on, the scale of his operation became apocalyptic. He was no longer just a smuggler, he was a sovereign entity, operating with the financial backing of the cartel and the logistical protection of the United States government. The violence in the border regions skyrocketed as he ruthlessly exterminated any remaining opposition, confident that no local police force or rival gang could touch him, while he held the FBI's leash. He had achieved the impossible. He had successfully merged the violent, chaotic world of the cartel with the rigid, bureaucratic power of federal law enforcement. He was the bridge between two warring worlds, profiting immensely from the slaughter on both sides. But an empire built on lies and stolen authority is inherently fragile. The higher he climbed, the more enemies he made. And the FBI, blinded by their own success, was completely unaware that they were sitting on a geopolitical time bomb that was ticking down to zero. The devil had secured his handshake, but the true cost of this unholy alliance was about to be paid in blood. He did not need to buy hitmen. He had the Federal Bureau of Investigation. For a rising cartel boss, the greatest expense and risk is eliminating the competition. Assassins cost money, leave evidence, and invite retaliation. But Informant X found a loophole in the American justice system. When a rival syndicate moved a massive shipment into a new territory, he did not send his own soldiers to intercept it. He picked up a secure phone, called his federal handlers, and provided the exact coordinates of the stash house. Hours later, heavily armed tactical teams would storm the compound. They would arrest the rival leaders, confiscate the product, and freeze the bank accounts. The local police would tape off the scene, the news cameras would roll, and the FBI would hold a press conference celebrating another victory against organized crime. But the moment the cameras turned off and the police cruisers drove away, the shadow war began. The territories left vacant by these federal raids were immediately occupied by the loyalists of Informant X. His soldiers moved into the abandoned neighborhoods, taking over the extortion rackets, the distribution networks, and the human smuggling routes. He absorbed the scattered foot soldiers of the broken cartels, offering them a choice between joining his invincible empire or facing the wrath of his personal federal hit squad. It was a hostile corporate takeover, subsidized by the American taxpayer. But the corruption ran deeper than just manipulated intelligence. To keep their star informant happy and productive, the federal agents granted him devastating operational immunities. He was classified as a top-tier intelligence asset, which meant his local activities were shielded from state and municipal police forces. If a local detective pulled over one of his supply trucks, a quick phone call to a federal handler would ensure the truck was released, without a search. Informant X was essentially handed a ghost pass. He began moving unprecedented volumes of contraband across international borders, fully aware that the agencies designed to stop him were actively protecting his logistics network. The sheer scale of his smuggling operation began to warp the local economy. Billions of illicit dollars were flowing through his hands, washing into legitimate businesses, real estate, and political campaigns. He was no longer just a criminal, he was a systemic infection, and the host organism, the federal government, was feeding the disease. However, you cannot hide an empire of that magnitude forever. The math simply did not add up. While the FBI was publicly celebrating the dismantling of several major syndicates, the overall volume of narcotics crossing the border was actually increasing. The violence in the streets was escalating, but it was highly concentrated, targeted, and unnervingly efficient. A junior intelligence analyst, working deep within the bureaucratic maze of the Department of Justice, began to notice the terrifying pattern. This analyst started cross-referencing the dates of the FBI raids with the expansion maps of Informant X and his territory. The correlation was undeniable. Every time the FBI struck a target, Informant X grew stronger. The analyst compiled a dossier, a stack of undeniable evidence proving that the government's greatest asset was actually its greatest liability. When this internal report landed on the desks of the senior FBI leadership, panic set in. This was not just a minor oversight. This was a catastrophic, career-ending failure of intelligence oversight. If the public discovered that the Bureau had spent years acting as the private security force for a global drug lord, the scandal would tear the agency apart. Congressional hearings would be called. Top officials would face criminal charges. The reputation of the FBI would be irreparably shattered. Faced with the choice between exposing the truth and protecting the institution, the leadership made a chilling decision. They chose the institution. The analyst who discovered the anomaly was quietly reassigned to a dead-end post. The files were classified under the highest level of national security protocols. buried deep in a vault where no journalist or oversight committee could ever find them. The cover-up was not about protecting Informant X. It was about protecting the men in suits who had enabled him. They were terrified of the monster they had created, but they were more terrified of the mirror. They ordered the handlers to continue the operation, but to slowly and carefully restrict the informant's freedom. They wanted to quietly sever the ties, without triggering a violent retaliation. But you cannot put a leash on a predator once it has tasted absolute power. Informant X immediately sensed the shift in the political winds. He knew the FBI was getting nervous. He knew the cover-up was a fragile shield that could shatter at any moment. So he did what any apex predator would do. He escalated the game. He began collecting leverage. He secretly recorded his phone calls with his federal handlers. He documented the names, the dates, and the specific favors he had been granted. He built his own shadow dossier, an insurance policy designed to ensure mutual destruction if the FBI ever decided to turn on him. He was no longer just a cartel boss running a drug empire. He was holding the United States intelligence community hostage. The psychological warfare reached a boiling point. The handlers were now operating in a state of perpetual terror, knowing that one wrong move could trigger a leak that would destroy their lives. They were trapped in a prison of their own making, forced to smile and shake hands with a man who had absolute control over their destinies. Year 11 marked the absolute zenith of his invisible reign. Informant X was no longer just a ghost in the machine. He was the machine itself. He had transcended the grimy, blood-soaked streets of the border towns and ascended to a realm of untouchable power. He was a king, wearing a crown forged by the United States government. His empire was vast, his wealth was incalculable, and his influence stretched from the lowest street corners to the highest echelons of political power. He had successfully weaponized the Federal Bureau of Investigation, turning the most elite law enforcement agency on the planet into his personal security detail and assassination squad. He was a phantom who pulled the strings of the justice system, and for a brief, terrifying moment in history, he was absolutely invincible. He held the lives of thousands in his hands, and he held the careers of top federal agents in his pocket. But the higher the Tower of Lies is built, the more devastating the inevitable collapse becomes. And the collapse of Informant X did not come from a rival cartel, an assassin's bullet, or a sudden burst of moral clarity from his federal handlers. It came from the one thing he could never completely control: human error. A fatal mistake was made not by the mastermind himself, but by a low-level associate who got careless over an unencrypted communication line. A seemingly insignificant wiretap, placed by an entirely different federal agency that was completely unaware of the FBI's highly classified secret arrangement, captured a conversation that was never meant to be heard by anyone outside the inner circle. The audio recording was devastatingly clear and utterly damning. It was a chaotic, explicit discussion detailing the exact nature of the symbiotic relationship between Informant X and his federal protectors. The recording outlined the coordinated tactical raids, the targeted assassinations of rival bosses, and the massive, multi-ton shipments of narcotics that were allowed to cross the international border under the impenetrable shield of federal immunity. This recording was not just evidence of a crime, it was a nuclear bomb, waiting to detonate in the very heart of, quote, Washington, D.C. When the rival intelligence agency brought this explosive recording to the highest levels of the, quote, Department of Justice, The reaction within the, quote, Hoover building was not a righteous crusade for the truth. It was a cold, calculated, and absolute panic. The senior officials realized instantly that if this tape was ever leaked to the press, the political and social fallout would be apocalyptic. The entire narrative of the multi-billion-dollar war on drugs would be exposed as a bloody, taxpayer-funded farce. The FBI, as an institution, might not survive the scandal intact. Dozens of high-ranking government officials, directors, and field agents would face decades in federal prison for treason, racketeering, and accessory to mass murder. The system immediately went into extreme survival mode. The priority was no longer justice, if it ever truly was. The priority was absolute containment. They needed to silence the anomaly, and they needed to do it before the tape reached the hands of an investigative journalist or a congressional oversight committee. The takedown of Informant X was not a televised spectacle. There were no triumphant press conferences, no proud speeches by ambitious politicians, and no flashing police lights illuminating the night sky. It was a surgical, deeply classified military-style operation, designed to permanently erase a monumental mistake. The FBI simply could not afford a public trial. A trial would mean legal discovery, aggressive cross-examinations, and the terrifying, very real possibility that Informant X would release his own shadow dossier of blackmail evidence onto the internet. They had to strike swiftly, silently, and with overwhelming force. Under the cover of total darkness, a specialized tactical team, operating entirely off the books and stripped of all identifying insignias, descended upon his heavily fortified mountain compound. The raid was executed with the lethal, silent efficiency of an agency that was fighting not for the law, but for its own institutional survival. Informant X was captured in his study, without a single shot being fired. He knew the game was over the moment the heavy shadow of the Black Hawk helicopters fell over his estate, blocking out the moonlight. He did not fight back. He did not run. He understood the brutal, unforgiving mathematics of absolute power better than anyone alive. He had played a dangerous, high-stakes game of geopolitical chess against the most powerful government on Earth for 11 years, and he had finally been checkmated by the very system he thought he owned. He was quietly handcuffed, blindfolded, and transported to a classified black site. This was a high-security, off-the-grid facility where his existence could be legally and physically erased from the public record. His massive criminal empire was systematically dismantled overnight. It was not taken down by rival gangs, but by the very federal agents who had actively helped him build it. The sprawling territories he once controlled were violently fractured, plunging the entire border region back into a chaotic, unprecedented bloodbath. As new, hungrier warlords desperately fought for the scattered scraps of his fallen kingdom. The United States government quietly seized his billions in hidden assets, scrubbed his name from all operational law enforcement databases, and classified the entire 11-year intelligence operation under the absolute highest levels of national security. The specific federal agents who had handled him, the ones who had signed the immunity deals and looked the other way while people died, were never prosecuted. Instead, they were quietly forced into early retirement or permanently transferred to obscure, dead-end administrative posts in the middle of nowhere. The catastrophic scandal was successfully buried under a massive mountain of heavily redacted documents and impenetrable bureaucratic silence. The American public was never told the truth. They were fed a carefully sanitized, easily digestible narrative of a successful, long-term undercover operation that finally culminated in the heroic arrest of a major transnational drug lord. The terrifying reality, the undeniable truth that the government had acted as a willing, active accomplice in the creation of a global monster, was locked away in a subterranean vault, completely hidden from the millions of taxpayers who had unknowingly funded the nightmare. The justice system did not fail in the tragic case of Informant X. That is the most horrifying realization of all. The system worked exactly the way he meticulously designed it to work. It was easily manipulated by institutional ego, completely driven by the desperate bureaucratic need for good public relations, and totally blinded by the dangerous illusion of absolute control. The Federal Bureau of Investigation, an iconic institution built upon the sworn, absolute pursuit of truth and justice, was easily bought and compromised with the simple promise of easy tactical victories and glowing newspaper headlines. They willingly traded their moral integrity for arrest statistics, and in doing so, they unleashed a devastating wave of violence and corruption that destroyed countless lives across two nations. This dark chapter of history forces us to confront a deeply unsettling, perhaps unanswerable question. If a mid-level street thug with enough cunning could completely compromise the highest levels of the United States intelligence community for over a decade, how many others are doing the exact same thing right at this very moment? As you sit there watching this video, somewhere in a highly classified, soundproof briefing room, a federal agent is sitting across from a dangerous criminal. They are shaking hands, exchanging deadly secrets, and making deals in the dark corners of the law. How much of the crime you see on the evening news is actually being orchestrated by the exact people we pay to stop it? We may never know the full, terrifying extent of the rot hidden deep within the system. But one thing remains absolutely certain in a world built on deception. The truth is never in the light. This is Shadow Dossier. Subscribe to the channel to unlock the next highly classified file, because the government's secrets are far darker than you could ever imagine.